Hi. Like Franz said, I just defended my thesis a few weeks ago. So it will be a lot of focus on the thesis work actually, and I'm also like Per Magnus, I'm going to be an expatriate going to Japan to continue studying soundscape in Japanese gardens after this. So it's a very interesting field to be in, like Franz mentioned earlier here. There's a lot of things happening, and I think we have already seen one example today. It's really interesting example, and also I'm looking forward very much to the rest of the day. And I would give my perspective. It's like Franz said, it's a quite broad approach to the sound environment and the concept of soundscape. I have been taking a broad approach on landscape architecture, as I'm coming from landscape architecture myself. I have a training as a landscape architect, and also a brief period of working with landscape architecture in practice. Some of my previous works are displayed here. This is just to give a kind of background to my going into writing a thesis on soundscapes in landscape architecture. I also have what I would describe as a qualitative background in sound. I've been working a lot. I'm coming from music, so I have a kind of experiential focus going into the sound, to a kind of field where a lot of the things that have been discussed about sound is related to noise. And as I will come back to that, I have tried to combine these two perspectives in the thesis work. And also my master project was also about sound, so I am very much into sound and soundscape. I think it's a very interesting field. So here is a picture of my thesis, and I will follow the disposition here in this presentation to give you an idea about my approach. And also, if you're interested, I brought a few copies that I can also, if you're interested, distribute. And I will start with some starting points into going into this. I already mentioned how I'm interested in sounds coming from music and also landscape. And the thesis work is essentially a combination of these two of my major interests. But I quite soon after working in landscape architecture, I realized that there was a kind of there was a lot of things that could be done in terms of thinking more about sound within the discipline. There is a notion of what has been called the third point there, a critique against landscape architecture and related discipline as not taking account for sound, and this is sometimes referred as ocular centrism, or a visual focus, which is related to the tools that are used within the profession. And I have read about this, and I also see it in studying landscape architecture and practicing landscape architecture. And at the same time, decisions in landscape architecture have a lot of influence on the sound environment in terms of acoustics, the choice of materials, and where you position different locations in the environment, and so on. So there's a lot of things that landscape architects can do in terms of influencing the sound environment. And this is a field that has been there is a lot of knowledge in the historical times of landscape architecture, but there is a sense that it has been forgotten during modernism. And this is problematic given the fact that sound influences health, behavior, and experience. And like Franz mentioned earlier, I'm going through a lot of these sources to motivate the working more with sound in landscape architecture, and also formulating strategies by which it is possible for landscape architects to work more with sound environment. And I will come back to this strategy. More, I would say, once again, mention how the thesis is essentially a combination of two different fields. We have, on the one hand, oh, sorry. Okay, we have on the one hand environmental noise management, which is working a lot of with the quantitative aspects of the sound environment, trying to protect people from noise, and this has also been referred to as a defensive strategy. And this is a noise map from Rehabilitation Garden in Alnarp, which is one of the papers I've been working on in the thesis. And on the other hand, I mentioned this also, how there is a kind of long tradition of working with sound in landscape architecture, focusing mostly on the experiential qualities of sound, like in this example, a Renaissance garden in Italy, where there are literally filled with different water installations and other experiential things about sound, like grottos, and so there is a long tradition. And in the thesis, I have tried to combine these in what I denoted as a soundscape approach to noise, basically taking an experiential perspective on the sound environment and working in noise-exposed situations to see how it is possible to potentially take a combination of these two perspectives in reducing noise impact. So this is from one of the studies, a picture conceptualizing the idea of a soundscape approach to noise. In this, I will return to this example project, but to give you an idea, it's a little bit about working with masking strategies and combine, that is to for instance, use the sound of water to reduce the impact of noise, and also combine this with other aspects, like in this case, noise screens. So the aim of the thesis was to facilitate soundscape thinking in landscape architecture. And it's based on 4 individual studies. I've already mentioned a couple of these, and I will give an overview later also. The thesis is practice-orientated. As this previous example I showed, it was a structure that was built on an urban square and subsequently evaluated in terms of experience of sound. And also, that's one example of how landscape architects could work with sound, but it's also a study of how landscape architects currently work with sound. So kind of working in both understanding the present practice and also looking into different ways of elaborating or coming up with new strategies. And this is what I will return to as a soundscape approach to noise, basically, is the outcome of that. Like I mentioned, the soundscape concept, we also heard this from Per Magnus earlier, is very much associated with Murray Schafer. It also has a prehistory of Schafer, but Schafer has been really important in my work, and to understand the experiential quality of sounds in a context as experienced by people. So I also used the ISO definition from 2014 to position the work. And generally speaking, I have been incorporating a mixed method approach, which has varied depending on the individual studies. And I will mention some brief aspects about these are the 4 studies. essentially the first one that's also from the rehabilitation garden where there was a noise map previously. There is a rehabilitation garden in Alnarp, and the second paper was a study of architectural competition dealing with how landscape architects are currently working with the sound environment in terms of reducing impact from noise, for instance, in a very noise-exposed situations. And this number 3 is the project I showed also a picture from with schematic color circles indicating how it's possible to work with sound environment in a noise-exposed context. This was a intervention that was built in Malmö on a public square, St. Knut's Torg. And the fourth paper was taking it all even one more step further in working with workshops with practicing landscape architects to come up with new solutions for working with sound in the profession of landscape architecture. So these are summary of the papers, and I will summarize some of the results here in so in the discussion of results in the thesis, which basically, as you can see here, leads to a soundscape approach to noise, the kind of essence of all of these studies. And the section also includes a discussion on current soundscape thinking in landscape architecture and a general discussion of the role of sound using the soundscape concept, and also discussing possibilities in a general manner. And so we come to the soundscape approach to noise, which is in the kind of practice-orientated approach. I come to the conclusion there are 3 different major aspects that landscape architects can use to work with sound in their designs, and this localization of functions and reduction of unwanted sounds and introduction of wanted sounds. And the first one of these is more kind of overall planning perspective in terms of where different different functions in the environment are located, to optimize, for instance, not making sure that not noise is situated close to areas where there is a need for tranquility, like a rehabilitation garden, for instance. And essentially, I also stress in the thesis that it's really important to consider not only one of these, as was the case a lot of the time in practice, particularly reduction of unwanted sounds, which is essentially the defensive strategy, the environmental noise management kind of focus on noise protection from sound, but also to include the other 2 areas as well. And particularly I investigated number 3 in terms of working with masking and how this is possible. In some cases it's not working, and in some cases it can work quite good, and it's depending on a lot of different aspects, like the sound pressure levels, the characteristics of the sounds, and that leads me to the deeper or the elaborated version of this model for comprehensive action, which is called this in paper 2, and in paper 4 it was an elaborated version called Soundscape Actions, in which 23 central ways of working with the sound environment are kind of discussed in relation to the present research situation. For instance, like I mentioned, auditory masking in number 3 here is a quite complex way of working. It can be really useful, but it's depending on sound pressure levels and so on. So I will come back now to the example project and tie this back with the general approach and discuss how this was also kind of working with all of these three aspects. So for instance, the situation of this intervention was on an urban square that was very noise exposed, coming close to the Amiralsgatan, for those of you who know Malmö. And this was intentional to position this intervention quite close to the noise exposure, to create a kind of contrasting environment within this small secluded space, which is called an arbor, Béchot. And to create this kind of, it was a kind of contrast, compensation, variation, and this was category 1 then, to consider the kind of localization, the context of where a place is. And the actual intervention was constructed from high noise screens, which is category 2 then, and this was designed as a kind of landscape feature, not putting so much focus on noise, but rather kind of trying to make an aesthetic impression of this as well. And finally, also category 3, which was the introduction of sound, was the addition of sound of forest through speakers that were incorporated in the space. So there was a sound of a small brook and some rustling leaves within the space. So it was a combination of different approaches, or you could call it a comprehensive approach to noise treatment, creating a tranquil space and doing this by working both with noise screens and masking strategies. And finally, some concluding remarks and ways going forward. Perhaps something we can also talk about here today, and I'm looking forward also to discussing in the break and so forth. As I mentioned, I'm going to Tokyo to study gardens. There is a long tradition of working with sensory aspects in Japan, I think, and I'm going to study Japanese gardens and the notion of forest bathing, if you've heard about this. When they say they take a bath in the forest when they take a walk in the forest to kind of reduce stress. And this is also related to the multimodal aspect, I think, very much that Per Magnus talked about. But just to conclude, the thesis increases the understanding for sound in landscape architecture and introduces strategies and tools as a soundscape approach to noise. An increased collaboration between environmental noise management and the design tradition is proposed, as this is considered of as working separately, and this was also found to be problematic in several cases. And it could be more creative to work more closely together and combine these traditions. Another aspect that was found was that the notion of representation was problematic, because all of the representations of sound that landscape architects work with are either noise maps or non-existing. So there's a lot of visual kind of tools in landscape architecture, and there is one thing that I discussed was the notion of oralization, where you can kind of simulate sounds in digitally. That could be an interesting thing in the future, also in relation to the notion of soundscape actions. The extended tool could be interesting to kind of see in real time how some of these aspects influence the sound environment. That could kind of motivate landscape architecture. And also I discussed some contemporary challenges and future prospects in terms of there is a discourse on densification and a lot of infrastructural changes, very much things happening in relation to city planning and sustainability. And it's also very relatable to the notion of quiet areas, I think, as this example project also illustrates. And finally, I want to emphasize the notion of variation, which also materialized in all of the 4 studies as a good approach, a basic approach to working with the sound environment. That kind of there was some people actually really enjoyed noisy environment, which is kind of haphazardly referred to as noisy environment, but this can also be a very important quality in cities. Like there is a kind of activation and interesting things associated with noise, but it's also important to have these kind of contrast, quiet areas. And I think the thesis introduces a set of tools by which to work with this and kind of create a purposeful and varied sound environment. And I think that's a good way to close this session. And
okay, thank you very much, Gunnar Cerwén.